to the HeartStream Musings podcast, a podcast to help you on your journey of self-love. I'm your host, Lisa Mae Francisco, a self-love coach and inner child guide. In the podcast, we'll dive deep on how to heal your inner child wounds, break your relationship patterns, and liberate your truth so you can claim the relationships in life that you deserve. Thanks so much for listening. I'm super excited that you're here. Hey everybody, welcome back. We made it to my second episode. Not gonna lie, I had a lot of resistance recording it, and it was funny because I'd actually already released the trailer and that was fun to record, but sitting down and recording my first episode about my why and how I got into coaching really just forced me to go deeper and share more of my truths. And for me, being vulnerable is scary. I'm sure it is for most of you. But I'm actually more scared with people I know than strangers because it's, ephemeral, but the sentiment was still true. So my inner child, who's afraid to be seen, showed up to the table. But through sitting with her and doing inner child work to understand the resistance, I realized she didn't want to be judged. She didn't want to be excited about something and not have anybody care. She just wanted that approval of, hey, I'm excited about this and this is cool and I hope you like it. But for today's episode, I'm going to touch upon all things around the topic of your inner child. This episode is going to be more educational with more of a did you know type of tone to it. And so some of the topics that I'm going to cover include origins of inner child work. What is the inner child? Why it's an important part of the process to breaking your generational relationship patterns, how I got started with inner child work, and the transformation that happens when you tap into connecting with your inner child. I think everyone talks about inner child work, but no one really hones in on it. And I just want to help you out. Let's break those generational relationship patterns so you can change the future for yourselves and others. Okay, so let's begin. Where the hell does inner child work come from and who coined this term? It sounds like some woo-woo shit, right? It's funny because I think I've always done some type of inner child work when working with different teachers, mentors, or therapists. And you probably have too. You might just not know it or classify it as inner child work. And so especially when someone had asked me to reflect on my childhood, I consider that to be a part of it, right? Connecting to that younger part of myself. But that's kind of just far as it went. I just recalled older memories, which, by the way, I couldn't remember for the life of me. I honestly just blocked out a lot of memories, which is actually an indication of disassociation or wanting to cover up something that was traumatic. It's a coping mechanism for your nervous system. So in essence, I did some form of inner child work by trying to connect to my childhood memories, just going back there. But the inner child was actually first coined by psychologist Carl Jung as an archetype. He called it the divine child archetype, and he believed that it represented our childlike inner feelings and emotions and influenced what we do and the decisions that we make. And, so if you don't know what an archetype is, it's a pattern or, a character type that is typically universally understood across, cultures, time, space. It seems that it's universally understood by a lot of different groups. And so, other examples for archetypes could be the feminine archetypes, and that includes maiden, mother, and crone. And so throughout our life, we embody these archetypes or just a multitude of archetypes in our personalities. And one of them is your inner child. So your inner child represents your inner feelings and your emotions. It holds both the light and the darkness of your childhood experiences. And so if your early experiences negatively affected you, you're most likely carrying those wounds in your day-to-day without even knowing it. And so those experiences are lodged in your subconscious and inform your thoughts, the beliefs you have about yourself and others, and ultimately translate into your actions. So, another question that I get a lot around this topic is, well, okay, how do you know that you actually need inner child work? Um, and so, because your inner child is within your subconscious, it's that part of you that never got to express themselves. It's that part of you that was repressed and is begging to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged. And so for me, my inner child appears anytime that I have fear, anxiety, or when I'm triggered, right? Ultimately, these emotions relate to my past and anything that I felt as a child at that time. And I actually call my inner child Little Lisa. And so in the past, she showed up a lot at work. Girlfriend came with me to work. In my previous jobs, I've always had to work with a lot of leaders, and my fear of authority would just kick in. It's kind of funny. Actually, no, it's not. But that's basically my 9 to 5, right? I ghostwrite for leaders, I help them with engagement, executive presence. Sometimes I coach them. But, your experience with authority figures happened at a very early age because your parents were your first authority figures. And so for me, I was very scared of my dad growing up. And so anytime I was around a authority figure, I would just tense up automatically. It was just like this subconscious reaction, right? It was very much a reactive, visceral part of my body that just happened to tense up anytime I was around leaders. And so I remember one time I was working with a leader who had just intense, masculine, dominating energy, and she would just kind of knock me off my center. Her presence definitely reminded me a lot of my dad, and I always wanted to hide from her. I just like wanted to limit my interactions with her. It wasn't because, you know, I didn't want to do a good job. It was just she just triggered the shit out of me. And she had a high bar of working with her, and you always had to be very buttoned up and you weren't allowed to make mistakes. So I personally didn't feel safe. I was always on edge, and my perfectionism definitely showed up. And so this dynamic of I need to be perfect in order for this leader to think I'm valuable and not fire my ass was the energy that I was actually acting from. And I definitely felt a lot of pressure. And I remember my interactions before and after with her were filled with so much anxiety, right? Like I did not want to have one on ones with her. I would push our meetings, I would talk to other people instead of her. That was part of her leadership team. It just, and that's where like the inner child wounds definitely inhibited me from progressing, right? It wasn't that I didn't want to be good. It was just these things were preventing me from reaching that place that I knew that I was capable of. And, in my culture, I'm Filipino. We're also very deferential to our elders. And that also influences my relationship with authority figures. And to be frank, it creates a problem because when you're asked to push back, it just feels like, okay, do I have permission to? Or, as opposed to someone else where it was kind of encouraged in their family to provide feedback to leaders, like, I'm sorry, but in Asian culture, you're just not allowed to push back. Your parents are always right. And so my mom used to always say that to me. She'd always say, like, I'm right because I'm older. Like that was the reason she would always give me because I'm older. And so that's one of the ways that my inner child would show up at work. And she definitely also shows up in romantic relationships. This is such a good one. And I'm sure so many people can relate to it. But I definitely think you can tell by the relationships you attract. I talk a lot about this in my content of how caretaker relationships inform who you attract and why. So for me, I was definitely attracted to the person who was not emotionally available because my dad wasn't growing up. And so, granted, he provided things I needed, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I had food, shelter, etc. But the emotional needs and love just wasn't there and wasn't his love language. It's like acts of service. Um, which was really sweet. I remember when I was younger, I was in volleyball. I was on the volleyball team and I needed black knee pads. And he actually drove, we live in the Bay Area, but he drove to Sacramento, like Stockton area, just to get me my black knee pads so I can fit in with the rest of the group because that was the color of our uniform. Everyone decided on black knee pads. So it was super sweet. But anyways, but through the work, I've learned to understand and forgive my parents because they couldn't give me what they never received, right? It's generational, a lot of this stuff. It's like, if you want to understand why your parents are the way they are, like look to their parents, have those conversations with them and ask them what it was like growing up for them. Were they afraid of their parents? And then were your grandparents afraid of their parents, right? A lot of this is just inherited. It's a different type of generational wealth. Um, but that's where it comes from. And that's why it's important to do this work because it allows you to consciously say, okay, like the buck stops with me. I'm not going to perpetuate it. I'm not going to pass this stuff down. I'm going to change it and create a different future for myself and others. Um, Okay, totally went on a tangent, but whatever. So that's where my unrealistic expectations were at play, right? Like my parents couldn't give me something that they didn't receive. And so it's interesting because it's like well, in 12-step groups they say it's going to the hardware store for orange. It's like, okay, I'm going to go to this hardware store. I know I only get tools, but I just want a damn orange, but you can't buy it from them. And so it's like wanting something that is not possible. And so it definitely came from this wounded place. And so, even though I wanted a loving relationship where the other, person who was of my romantic interest was available and could meet me, the truth was my inner child was just running the show. Um, little Lisa, she was there. She was definitely still playing out the father daughter dynamic in my romantic life, trying to heal that wound. And she would self sabotage. So anytime there was someone who showed interest, it felt off. And I mistook it as not having chemistry with someone when really I was just reenacting a familiar dynamic. And it was like little Lisa needed that relationship that was familiar in order to rewrite the past and feel love. So she definitely thought the only way to heal was to create a dynamic that literally mirrored what I had with my dad and change it like that, as opposed to just finding someone who would already meet my emotional needs and make me feel secure. There was something about like changing the person from like unavailable to available. I definitely think movies play a part in that when you have like the unavailable jock who all of a sudden has like a soft heart and like goes after the girl. Um, but it was like I got even more validation and credibility from being able to change something into something else, right? It was like I did that. So thinking that I had ownership of things that were obviously beyond my control. And that's something that I've had to look at too. Um, so when I look back at these dynamics that I was in, it was never really about the men I was with. It was about my inner child needing and seeking an opportunity to change the narrative. And it's important to note that the motivation, whether it's your inner child running the show or you as a conscious person trying to heal, it all comes from the same place. It all comes from the same motivation of trying to create a different narrative, trying to create a different experience for yourself so you can heal and you can have it not affect you in the way where it feels sometimes debilitating. I would often get mad or blame the other person for not being available, but it was just my inner child. It was my subconscious. It was my shadow running the show from that wound of wanting to be loved by my dad. It was my father wound. And that just, was definitely present in a lot of my relationships. And so instead of getting mad at myself and saying, oh my God, why the hell are you attracting these dynamics? They're so old. And why don't you why don't you learn from them? What's wrong with you? Or just being so mean to myself. I can learn to sit with little Lisa and understand her and hear her out, which is something that she was never given, right? If you look back as to, you know, the inner child as that subconscious part of you and wanting to express, itself, then give them the opportunity to express these emotions that they felt like they had to repress, right? And so, that's definitely what reparenting looks like. It means acting as if you were the best fucking parent you ever had. It's actually really empowering because you're not staying in that victim mode waiting for your parents to change. You understand them with right size expectations of like, okay, this is who they are. You allow them to show up as they are without any expectations and getting disappointed. But more of like, okay, I can self source, I can change the narrative by being the person that I want, by being the most loving person to myself. And in actuality, when you learn to consistently love yourself, it just changes the game, right? It lets others off the hook. And so, in the relationships that we have with other people, we have wounds that come up. And, for me, I call them my inner child wounds. Everyone has different ones, but these are the ones that I've come to find from doing this work. And some of them include feeling unworthy. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this. And so, when I think about feeling unworthy, it's really about questioning my deservingness of things I want or what I dream of. Do I think that I actually deserve this? Or, you can still dream about wanting something, but then when you ask someone if they deserve it, then that's a completely different story. Um, and that just plays a lot into whether or not you have the courage to take those action steps to get the thing that you want. Another inner child wound that comes up includes not belonging, right? Not having a sense of belonging, feeling like I'm an outsider, that, my differences from others are bad. So as a result, I'll kind of shape shift to feel a part of and liked and hide who I truly am. And another one is not feeling important. So feeling like I don't matter to someone, like my needs aren't a priority. And if I feel like my needs aren't going to be met, then it looks like me not voicing my opinions, feeling like I don't have a voice, just kind of giving up before even stating anything. Um, a big one is not being able to trust anyone or myself for that matter. Like I'm really, really working on self trust right now and not letting other people's opinions affect the decisions I make because I need to trust my intuition, my gut, and increase my belief and my efficacy of making things that I want to happen. And so not trusting anyone or feeling like you can't trust yourself, it can appear as feeling insecure about the other person. It might mean thinking that the other person is cheating or will leave, or, that you don't trust yourself to make the right decisions. And it can definitely show up as being hypervigilant of other people, looking for anything kind of ominous or just off. It's like you have that sixth spidey sense. um, and the last one is not feeling safe. So, not feeling safe to open up, share parts of myself because I have a fear of being rejected and criticized or just disliked. It's like it's kind of like a sense of belonging where it's like not feeling part of the tribe, um, being who you are, and that's where the false mask kind of happens, right? So it's like, okay, if that's what you like, then let me shape shift and be who you want me to be. So then I can always be like, there's like some security and being accepted. So sometimes one of those wounds can come up, or, they can all come up at once. But once I'm able to identify which wound is triggered in running the show, reparenting becomes a solution and moment of healing where I can connect to the little me and talk to little Lisa about that wound. I can reaffirm her, I can connect to her. And so what happens is I get to diffuse the situation, and I understand that the actual situation is a trigger from my past and a wound. And so I love viewing relationships as opportunities to learn what needs more healing. It's never about the other person. If anything, that other person teaches me what needs to be loved in me and what parts I don't want to look at, those icky parts that make me feel like, ugh, I just don't even want to acknowledge that. And, other people are our greatest teachers. And so, granted, I think there needs to be something said if you're participating in a toxic dynamic of a relationship and blame yourself for the relationship, then that's where you need to reflect and do the deep inner work of why you're in this relationship, why you love the hot and cold behavior, and what gets you off about it. Like, what intrinsic need is it fulfilling? And, is it the need to make your quote unquote mommy and daddy love you, or whatever projection you have from the past? You can definitely do reparenting if that's the issue at hand, of understanding, okay, what was a relationship like with my parents, and why do I want this approval? Where did I learn that, you know, having this dynamic of being hot and cold was actually normalized? And so now that we've talked about what is inner child, how you need it, the wounds that come up, you're probably thinking, okay, well, I do want to do this, but how do I connect to my own inner child and access that part of me? And so it can be as simple as remembering the things you love when you were little, right? Like, think about the TV shows, the food, the friends, the music that you love when you were little. Um, I have this little Lisa playlist filled with 90s alternative rock because that's what was playing on the radio when I grew up. And whenever I play that playlist, it makes me so happy. It's the easiest way for me to connect with little Lisa when I put on that playlist. And I also connect with her when I'm riding my bike outside because that was my favorite activity. I loved riding bikes with my sister after school on our street. It was so much fun. And I have a bike now, and whenever I just feel like playing, I just ride my bike down the street. Um, but your inner child isn't just going to show up overnight. It might seem woo woo at first, like it's so weird. I don't know how to talk to that part of myself. Or, a lot of people think like talking to yourself they might think you're crazy. But I mean, what's more crazier, right? Like living in your ruins and not getting the life you want because you're stuck in these patterns, or just trying new something out, right? Like pick your poison. And it might be awkward, but just as you would get to know a new friend, you're building a new relationship with your younger self. So it's important to establish those micro connections with the little you. And if you're the type to like writing, you can even journal and write to your inner child and write them a letter. That's actually how I began doing this work. Was like, I love writing. I really identify with being an artist, and, writing's my medium. Tell that to people all the time. And so for me, I did the thing that was most comfortable, which was writing, and, trying to establish a connection that way. And I actually really enjoyed it because then in a couple months after, I got to reflect on those cards that I would give to myself and reread it of, where I was at that time when I wrote it and how much more meaningful it was to me in the future. And so, I definitely encourage you to be open. Just be open to it, open to this practice because, breaking your generational relationship patterns, it's not linear. Reparenting is a big part of that because you're literally rewriting a new story with you as the ideal parent you never had. So when you start to show up for your inner child with integrity and consistency, that's when it becomes life changing. So be open to this connection to change your future. And lastly, what are the benefits of inner child work? What is the transformation? For me, I'll talk to anybody about self love and inner child work because I get so excited about it. It's literally life changing. So I'm a big proponent of doing this deep inner work. But if all your wounding happened in childhood, then why wouldn't you, quote unquote, time travel to meet the little you and envision yourself being there for them when times were hard or when you felt hurt? And so, as a result of doing this, you get to lessen the energy behind your triggers. And so, like, who doesn't want that? Just from doing this work, I've learned to practice my sacred nose and stand up for little Lisa in situations where she felt undermined. I really stepped in and became her advocate. And I've definitely tamed my inner critic, becoming more loving and accepting of my faults, not even seeing these things as faults, but parts of me that I get to love that I wanted to hide before. And so, I've even stopped being attracted to relationships where I wanted to be with other people I could fix. This definitely came from a place of feeling like I had purpose from problem solving, right? Like, it's kind of strange that it gets so affirmed at work. I mean, it makes sense, how many problems you can fix. But I don't feel like I have to fix anyone in a relationship. It's not hot to date a hot mess to me, and it's such a turnoff to me now. And I get to be in relationships with people who are responsible for themselves. Like, to me, that's attractive, being in a partnership with people who can admit when they're at fault. They don't blame me for their behavior and responses. I'm met with understanding, compassion, and love. Um, and from doing this work, I also have a connection to my inner voice, my truth, and my guide. I don't suppress that gut instinct and actually value it as my authentic self coming through. And so by bathing myself in quiet allows me to create space for what needs to come through without other voices infiltrating my vibe. And so by tending to my inner child, I've learned to become more myself and more of the woman I want to embody, which people often equate as your highest self. And, I could just go on with this list, but these are just some of the benefits that I've experienced firsthand, of what it's like of doing this work and the transformation that I've experienced. And when I tell people about my experiences in the past and what it was like, and they're just like, what? How is that even possible? And I tell them, yep, self love and inner child work. But anyways, thank you so much for tuning in and listening to my story about the inner child, what it is, how you know you need to do the work, the wounding that comes up, and how to connect to the little you, and of course, the benefits. In the next episode, I will be sharing specifically on how I began my journey of self love and the process of changing my generational relationship patterns with inner child work. So I truly hope this episode serves you. If you want to work with me one-on-one, you can actually check out my website, lisamaycoaching.com. I have a page where I list all of my offerings. I also have online events. And if you're local in San Francisco, I have some in-person events too. But the best way to stay connected is to subscribe to my newsletter, HeartStream Musings, where I share weekly self-love tips, tools, and offerings on how to work with me. So thank you again for listening. But before I sign off, here's my question for you today. So what are you doing to fill your self-love cup and connect to the little you? All right, bye everyone, and I will catch you next time.